I think I always realized I wanted to be an artist since I was very young. I tried to track back to memories of when that occurred. I do remember I had dinner when I was 10, was my friend's grandparents' house, and she asked what I wanted to be, and I said an artist, and then she laughed and said good luck making any money, and I think that really gave me I'm doing this. And then I did lots of art classes as a kid, and there was lots of art in the house. My parents took us to art exhibits, and then at 13 my first foray into art was glass blowing, so I just think it was something I always wanted to do. Yeah, research is a big part of my practice, and so there's a lot of particular artists that I'm drawn to and how they work, and that gives me a lot of guidance. So one of my biggest influences, I would say, is Tracy Emin as an artist and her energy. And then in my real life, there's certain artists that I've met on the internet and become long distance friends with, and those influences have also helped who I've become as an artist. I suppose always being honest with what I want to do as an artist, because there's a lot of pushback or a lot of criticism or what other people think of what you're doing. And also when you're creating art, you're also pushing against a kind of status quo or a paradigm that already exists. So to always be keeping yourself in check, and that what you're doing is the most honest version of your work and yourself. I suppose it's always having a conversation with myself and being my biggest critic, and being able to step away from the work and see it, just shutting everyone out. How do I actually do that? I don't know, maybe it's kind of a mini tantrum. I probably have to separate myself from everyone that I know a little bit and get that silence. Sometimes it's biking to a field and just lying out there and just getting that solitude. And continually questioning what I'm being told, and that knowing that validation through money or art shows aren't actually the value of the work in itself, that it comes from something other than that. So I guess just always being hard with myself in that way. I think art's absolutely vital in how we move and function as a society. As we want to move forward, it's art that kind of perpetuates the ideals and where we want to go as people, or So to me, it's what art is an idea. It's basically philosophy that's made into material, whether it be sculpting, painting, singing, or whatever, really. And what that does is that it enters this public zone of communication where other people can be looking at it, and then it pushes us to a space where we've never been before. And so to me, art's really vital in making us think differently. And it always has to be kind of on the outside. Popular art it does something for in its time, but I think other art has to kind of push us to a place that we don't even know we're going to yet. No, it's definitely, I defined who I am and how I interact within the arts community, in the sense that I hate being told what to do. I like being my own boss, and I think that's also an important part for any art maker. It's not that I'm anti-school in any way, I just know what works best for me. And again, what I was saying is that school is a certain way of thinking, and it is in itself a paradigm that you're being taught, and that's just one thing that you have to work with and then either unteach yourself and so I just decided to go a different route. And there's not a lot more, but there's a different struggle in that. I didn't get the same kind of validation of having someone direct me. All the direction had to come from myself. And then also finding a community for myself is that in art school, you're put together with a bunch of people and you're interacting. And so I think it's super important to have an arts community and people that you're interacting with. And having not gone to school, I had to find those people myself. And so I think I'm already an outgoing person, but I had to be even more outgoing in how I interacted with the community and finding the people that I had a meaningful interaction with. Sometimes it's weird, sometimes it seems like it loops back on itself, but I think it used to be a lot more narrative driven, a lot more figurative, and I've moved towards the idea of the embodiment of feeling and like the movement through that in my body. And I do think that that circles back to how I referenced doing glass blowing at 13, because I think that very much influenced how I move as a painter and an art maker, in the fact that it's a very physical activity and it's very immediate, and you listen to loud music and you're moving, and like I make large paintings, and so I think that from that structure I looped back into like the honesty of that earlier moment of how I like to make art. So it's hard to say, I just think it's like this weird dialogue of like sometimes you think you're pushing away from where you were, but I think you sometimes always come back to who you are by nature. I think for me it's the fact that currently, or for the time being, I'm able to support myself through what I do, and because time is the most important part of being, well, probably alive, but as an art maker is the most important thing, and so that I can afford to have all my time as my own time, and I can leisurely or as intensely interact with that and structure it to my art, so that my whole life is my art. So I take a lot of pride in the fact that I can do that. Yeah, I have no clue. Like that's what like I like as an art maker, is that I never know what I'm going to do next. And there's some artists who are maybe more analytical, or they sit down and they think of what the next thing's going to be. I kind of do all that stuff behind the curtain of maybe my subconscious, and I just kind of like live my life, sponge in everything, and then when I'm ready, it happens, and usually when it happens, I'm surprised by it. And I think that moment of surprise is really important for myself as an artist, because it challenges me, and then also like that kind of sense of awe. Like I don't necessarily see it as a shift as much as it is a shift in the work, is that I was doing these figurative pieces that kind of were deconstructing into just form or color or lumps of things, and even though you could maybe see what it was, that process and that way of thinking lends itself to the landscapes I just finished, and in the sense like how I paint, that hasn't really changed, and so that's where I see the connection between it. But in that way, like where the figure was what the viewer was looking at, I kind of took that away, and it's as though the viewer themselves became that fleshy part that was looking into the landscape, and so I feel like I changed how the view moved. Like rather than looking at the lumps, you became a lump. And then the clouds in themselves are very also kind of gestural. They almost have like a feeling of body to them. And so I think that's very much in dialogue with the prior work. And then at the same time, I think I just got a little bit exhausted of having people visually in it. And because the series is called The Effects of Excess Crying on the Landscape, I wanted to look at the emotional landscape. And so in that way, it implies the body. To me, they're one. The poetry and the painting, obviously they don't happen simultaneously, but the action in themselves seem the same. So if I'm writing, that can quickly become a painting, or if I'm painting, I can suddenly start writing. And in that, like, I identify as a painter in anything that I do. Like if I'm sculpting or if I'm doing performance art, I still identify as a painter, because I think there's something about when you love painting, it is integrated in everything that you do, how you move and think. And so no matter necessarily what, maybe that sounds contradictory, but there's like, no matter what the medium of how I'm doing it, it's still painting. And I think because there's a huge lineage of painters, and I identify with that most greatly. And so in that sense, my poetry is like painting to me. So I used to have a very diligent studio practice. No, and I think it's important too. So like, I used to go to the studio, because I had a studio separate from my home, and I used to go to the studio probably 8 to 10 hours a day, 7 days a week. It didn't necessarily make me very happy, even though I was doing what I love best. And so when I moved my studio into my home, I kind of chilled out a little bit more, and I realized that everything I do can be my art practice. So if I'm making muffins, I'm making art, and if I'm going for a bike ride, I'm making art. And so in this way, it's like my whole life became the art making, which is also a very important thing to me. And so yes, I think a daily practice is really important, but it's a matter of how you think of what that daily practice is. I don't want to be a product maker, and I think that's where the division happened, is that like I could be in the studio every day and make a drawing, make a painting, and be making something, but what does that mean? Like, I don't want to just be somebody who makes tons of stuff. I want the things that I make to be incredibly important because I felt that in that moment it had to be made. And so in that sense, a lot of the shift of the studio practice became part of my whole life, and it's integrated completely. So that wouldn't work for everybody, but for me, the ideas and how I think and move now as a painter is much more fluid. So a lot of my figurative work that I was doing in the last 4 years dealt a lot with the nude body and pornography, and so I was looking at a lot of classical elements of the naked body in art, and then what the modern day nude looks like, and in the proliferation is pornography, which is like a very subversive thing that we rarely communicate, whereas with the nude within like classical art is something that you could see in any kind of venue nowadays. And so taking those two things and combining them together in the format of oil painting, which has a long history, and negotiating that through like a feminist gaze. And so that followed through my work to the present day. Even though I did the landscape series, at the same time I was doing a series that dealt with, again, the figures. And so so I have that, and then it's really a setting of where I sometimes put those ideas. And so it's like there's landscape or interiors, and looking at where where memory and history and identity kind of come together. So like an interior, how we look at an interior as a place that represents ourselves, and who has those places and who doesn't. And the same with little, like when I put land into my paintings, is also a sense of ownership, who has the land, who doesn't, and that sense of existing on it. So things like that are important thematically to how I work. And then also a movement from there is looking at classical works. So looking at a lot of older canon paintings and putting them into a different context of nowadays, of how we look at those things that have become so integrated, especially in the sense of like a Western idea of looking at art, and kind of putting them into ruins. I really like the idea of a ruin, and so I'll take a lot of like either color palette from classical artworks and then put them together into a new painting. So again, it's like me coming to terms with the long history that we sit upon as like individuals and as an artist. So that's an important theme in how I work. So I guess like, yeah, so sexuality, femininity are very important to how I work. And then like with anything, I would say all art is political, so that's important.